So let me quickly refresh our knowledge on how the web works. If you're totally aware of all of this, you can of course skip this lecture. Now, the web works like this. We got a user, a client, maybe you, sitting in front of your browser visiting a web page, or already being on a web page and submitting a form. So you're interacting with web pages. Let's say you're visiting it. So you're entering some URL into your browser. And what happens behind the scenes is actually that the browser reaches out to some domain name servers to look that domain up, because this domain is not really the address of your server. It's basically an encoded human readable version of that address, you could say. Your server itself has just an IP address. But this is just some technical thing behind the scenes. In the end, you enter this URL and it will lead to some server. You therefore, or the browser therefore, sends a request to that server with that given IP address I mentioned. So the IP address belonging to that domain. Now, thus far, that's all interesting, but now we reach the part where Node.js comes into play, where your Node.js code matters. You write the code that runs on that computer in the internet which has that IP address. You write the code that spins up that server which is able to handle the incoming request and do something with it. Now, you don't need to use Node.js for this. You could use PHP, ASP.NET, Ruby on Rails, anything like that, but in this course we'll obviously use Node.js because, well, it's a Node.js course. Now, in this code, you can do all kinds of things, and I already mentioned this in the first course module: user input validation, communicating with a database maybe, which runs on a separate database server, but which you typically reach out to from your backend, so your server-side code. And once you're done with that, you do one important thing. You send back a response to the client. This response can be some HTML text, some HTML code, which is then handled by the client, but it could also be some other kind of data, like a file, some JSON or XML data. The response is more than just the content, by the way. A response and also a request also has headers. This is some meta information which is attached to request and response, describing what's inside it, for example. But we'll see this too. So this is how the web generally works, and Node.js is the part we will focus on. It is the code that makes up that server in the end. Now, that request and response transmission is done through some protocol. So basically a standardized way of communicating, you could say, because obviously to correctly handle a request and send back a response the browser can work with, we have to follow some rules. And these rules are defined by the protocol we use, HTTP or HTTPS. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and there we simply define, or it is defined, how a valid request looks like and how the data should be transferred from browser to server and the other way around. And HTTPS simply is the same, with SSL encryption turned on, where all the data that is transmitted is actually encrypted, so that if anyone is spoofing your connection, they can't read your data. Now, towards the end of the course, I will show you how to enable HTTPS. For the majority, we'll just use HTTP, since we'll only be developing that code. We'll only work on it locally. But once we put it into production, I will also show you how to turn on that SSL encryption. This is how the web works in a nutshell and how Node.js is related to it. And this is exactly where we will now continue working with Node.js and where we will now finally create a server with Node.js.